Have you ever noticed that the moment you need someone's approval the most, it seems to slip further out of reach? You send a message and immediately regret it. You explain yourself one more time, hoping this will be the sentence that finally makes them understand. You feel the ground shift beneath a relationship, and instead of standing still, you chase it. Reassurance, affection, proof that you still matter to them. And the strange part is, the harder you chase, the more distant it feels. You've probably been told that attraction is about the right words, the right timing, the right moves. Say this. Don't say that. Wait 3 days. Play it cool. As if a woman's heart were a lock that could be picked with the correct sequence of behaviors. So you try to perform. You try to say the smooth thing, hide the anxious thing, calculate the next step like a chess match you're terrified of losing. But somewhere underneath all of that performance, there is an exhaustion you don't talk about. A quiet, private fatigue that comes from constantly managing how you're perceived instead of simply existing as yourself. Here is the uncomfortable truth: what you have been calling trying too hard is not a communication problem. It is not a technique problem. It is a self-command problem. 2,000 years ago, a group of philosophers understood something about the human condition that modern dating advice has almost completely forgotten. That the moment you try to control another person's feelings, you lose control of your own. And it is the loss of that inner control, not a lack of charm, that quietly extinguishes attraction before it has a chance to grow. This video is not about tricks. It's not about manipulation, and it's not about becoming someone you're not. It's about 6 psychological truths, rooted in Stoic philosophy, that explain why some men become impossible to forget. Not because they chased, but because they never needed to. This isn't only about romance. The way you show up in a relationship is a mirror of the way you show up in every part of your life. How you handle rejection, how you respond when a coworker undermines you, how you sit with uncertainty instead of demanding it resolve immediately. Attraction, it turns out, is simply a very honest test of your character, because a woman experiencing you in real time is watching how you handle her disagreement, her distance, her bad mood, her silence. She's not evaluating your lines. She's evaluating your nervous system. Most men have never been taught to look at it this way. They've been taught to fix the outside, the wardrobe, the gym routine, the opening line. While the inside remains reactive, anxious, and starving for validation, it was never taught to generate for itself. By the end of this video, you will understand 6 specific emotional triggers, not manipulation tactics, but genuine internal shifts, that separate men who are quietly magnetic from men who are constantly, exhaustingly trying. You will understand why the philosophy of men like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, written for soldiers, emperors, and slaves navigating an unpredictable world, applies with startling precision to modern love. And you will walk away with something more valuable than a script for what to say to her. You will walk away with a blueprint for who to become, regardless of whether she ever notices at all. Because that, as you're about to learn, is exactly the point. If any part of what you just heard felt like it was describing a version of you that you've been quietly trying to outgrow, you are exactly who this channel exists for. We make these videos for men who are done performing and ready to build something real underneath the surface. If that's you, consider staying a moment longer. Subscribing costs nothing, but it tells us this message is reaching the person it was written for, and it helps us keep making the kind of content that doesn't just entertain you, but actually changes how you move through the world. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why do intelligent, capable, otherwise disciplined men fall apart emotionally the moment romantic uncertainty enters the picture? A man who can negotiate a business deal without flinching will lie awake analyzing a 2-word text message. A man who stays composed under professional pressure will spiral over 30 minutes of silence from someone he's dating. The obvious answer is that we care more about romantic connection than almost anything else, so of course it hits harder. But that's only the surface. The deeper answer is something the Stoics identified with uncomfortable precision. We suffer not because of what happens to us, but because of the meaning we assign to it, and in romance, most men assign meaning based on a story they cannot verify. Silence becomes rejection. A slower reply becomes disinterest. A cancelled plan becomes evidence that you were never enough to begin with. None of these interpretations are facts. They are inferences, built on old wounds, insecurities, and fears that existed long before this particular woman walked into your life. Epictetus put it simply, it is not events that disturb people, but their judgments about events. Most men never examine the judgment. They only feel the disturbance, and they mistake the feeling for the truth. This is why knowing the right advice rarely works. You can memorize 100 rules about texting back later or not seeming needy, but if your internal state is one of anxious dependence, it will leak out anyway. In your tone, your urgency, your inability to simply let a moment be what it is instead of needing it to be reassurance. The advice treats the symptom. The Stoics treated the disease. The invisible habit keeping most men trapped is this: they have outsourced their sense of security to someone else's behavior. Her mood becomes your mood. Her attention becomes your self-worth. And once your emotional center of gravity lives inside another person, you are no longer a man she is drawn to, you are a man orbiting her, and orbiting is not attractive. It's exhausting to witness, because on some level, everyone can sense when someone else's entire emotional weather system depends on their next move. So the real question isn't, what should I say or do differently? It's, why does my peace currently depend on someone else's choices? That question is where the first principle begins. Picture this scenario. You've been seeing someone for a few weeks. She doesn't respond to your message for 6 hours. In that gap, most men run an entire emotional simulation. Did I say something wrong? Is she losing interest? Should I send a follow-up? Should I seem busy? Should I panic quietly while pretending not to? The 6 hours of silence becomes 6 hours of internal chaos, and by the time she finally responds with a simple, unbothered, "Hey, sorry, work was crazy," the man has already lived through an emotional ordeal she never intended to cause. This is the pattern the Stoics spent their entire philosophy trying to interrupt. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire while battling war, plague, and betrayal, wrote to himself constantly that he could not control external events, only his response to them. If an emperor facing actual catastrophe could train himself toward that composure, a delayed text message is a strange place for a modern man to lose his center. Now picture the same 6 hours from a different internal position. The man doesn't perform indifference. He genuinely isn't destabilized, because his sense of self was never dependent on her response time in the first place. He continues his day. He's present with his work, his friends, his own goals. When she finally replies, he responds warmly, without the residue of anxiety bleeding through his words. The difference isn't in what either man eventually says back to her. It's in what happened internally during the waiting. One man's identity was hijacked by uncertainty. The other man's wasn't, because he understands something crucial. Her behavior is information, not a referendum on his worth. This is not about suppressing feelings or pretending indifference. It's about recognizing that you cannot control what she does, but you retain full control over whether her actions get to dictate your internal state. That distinction, control over response versus illusion of control over outcome, is the exact fault line Stoicism draws, and it happens to be the fault line that determines whether a man feels secure or desperate in the eyes of someone he's falling for. The practical takeaway is simple to state and difficult to live. Your emotional stability cannot be conditional on her next move. The moment it is, you've handed her the steering wheel of your own nervous system, and paradoxically, that's the moment she starts to lose interest in driving. But emotional stability alone isn't enough. Because even a calm man can still lose himself in a different way, by slowly disappearing to keep the peace. There's a quieter kind of self-erosion that many men never notice happening, because it doesn't look dramatic. It looks like agreeableness. It looks like flexibility. It looks like, "It's fine," said one too many times when it wasn't fine at all. Consider a man who consistently rearranges his plans to accommodate someone who rarely reciprocates. Consider a man who swallows a comment that stung because he doesn't want to seem sensitive or difficult. Each individual moment feels small, forgivable, even generous. But compounded over weeks, something happens beneath the surface. He starts to feel less like a man with his own gravitational pull, and more like a satellite whose only function is accommodation. Seneca warned against a particular kind of self-betrayal, the tendency to abandon your own principles piece by piece in exchange for someone else's temporary approval. He wasn't writing about romance specifically, but the mechanism translates perfectly. Every time you override your own values to avoid friction, you teach both yourself and the other person that your boundaries are negotiable. And nothing quietly kills attraction faster than the sense that someone has no floor beneath them, no point at which they would actually walk away. This isn't about ultimatums or coldness. It's about knowing, with calm clarity, what you will and will not tolerate, and being willing to act on that knowledge even when it's uncomfortable. A man who can say, without anger, "That doesn't work for me," and mean it, communicates something no amount of charm can fake. He has a self worth protecting. Here's the psychological reality most people intuitively sense but rarely articulate. Respect is not generated by how much you give. It's generated by what you're willing to walk away from. A man who tolerates everything to keep someone around isn't proving his devotion. He's demonstrating that his presence in her life doesn't actually cost her anything, and things that cost nothing are rarely valued. Boundaries, held with warmth rather than resentment, do something remarkable. They tell the other person exactly where the solid ground is. And people, especially those who have been let down before, are drawn instinctively towards solid ground. Before we go further, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever caught yourself rehearsing a conversation in your head for hours, replaying what you should have said, softening a boundary you knew you needed to hold, just to avoid the discomfort of a moment of tension? If that's ever been you, you're not alone, and I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you held your ground, or wish you had. Reading these threads is one of my favorite parts of making this channel, because it reminds all of us that this struggle is far more universal than it feels at 2 in the morning. Most people confuse confidence with volume. They picture the loud man, the one who dominates a room, who never seems to doubt himself out loud. But real confidence, the kind that draws people in rather than exhausting them, is almost always quieter than that. Think about the difference between a man who constantly needs to mention his achievements, his status, his opinions being right, and a man who simply moves through a room without needing anyone's validation of who he is. The first man is performing confidence for an audience because some part of him isn't sure it's true unless someone else confirms it. The second man isn't performing anything. His sense of self doesn't require a witness. Epictetus made a distinction that feels almost prophetic when applied here. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. Our own judgments, choices, and character are within our control. Other people's opinions of us are not. The moment a man starts building his confidence on the shifting ground of other people's approval, he's built his house on sand, and he will spend his entire life anxiously checking the foundation. Real confidence, the Stoic kind, comes from trusting your own judgment rather than outsourcing it. It's the difference between a man who asks, "Does she like me?" every hour with quiet desperation, and a man who has already decided he likes himself, regardless of the answer. Ironically, the second man is almost always the one she ends up liking more, because there is nothing more magnetic than someone who isn't asking to be chosen, someone who has already chosen himself and is simply open to being joined. This isn't arrogance. Arrogance is loud because it's insecure underneath. Quiet confidence doesn't need to convince anyone of anything. It simply exists, unbothered, and lets people draw their own conclusions in their own time. There is a particular kind of attention that almost no one experiences anymore. The feeling of being fully seen by someone who isn't simultaneously performing, calculating their next line, or mentally elsewhere. In a world of constant distraction, presence has become rare enough to feel almost intoxicating. Picture two versions of a dinner conversation. In the first, a man is half listening while quietly strategizing his next witty remark, checking his phone under the table, wondering if he's being interesting enough. In the second, a man is simply there, asking a real question because he's genuinely curious about the answer, noticing the small details in what she says, letting silence exist without rushing to fill it. The second man isn't trying harder. In some ways, he's trying far less, because he isn't managing an internal performance review of himself in real time. He's just present. And presence, more than any clever line, is what makes another person feel like they matter, not because of anything you say, but because of the quality of attention you're offering. The paradox here is important. Presence requires you to not be emotionally dependent on the outcome of the interaction. If you desperately need this conversation to go well, you cannot be fully present in it, because part of you is always monitoring the scoreboard. True presence is only available to someone who isn't afraid of how the moment turns out. This is where the earlier principles start to connect. Emotional stability gives you the composure. Self-respect gives you the ground to stand on. Quiet confidence removes the need for a performance. And presence is what all three make possible. The ability to give someone your full, undivided attention without a hidden agenda underneath it. It is, quite simply, one of the rarest and most valuable things a person can offer another human being. By now, a pattern should be emerging, and it's worth naming directly. None of these principles are actually about her. Every single one is about your relationship with yourself. This is the deeper truth beneath the entire topic. The real battle was never with her silence, her mood, her attention, or her approval. The real battle has always been internal, between the part of you that seeks external validation to feel whole, and the part of you capable of generating that wholeness on your own. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, in the privacy of a journal never meant for publication, that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. If your thoughts are constantly colored by someone else's next move, your entire inner life becomes a reflection of forces outside your control. This is why chasing rarely works, no matter how well-intentioned. You cannot make someone feel deep attraction toward you by trying harder to be worthy of it, because the trying itself signals the very insecurity you're attempting to hide. Attraction is not won through effort directed outward. It is revealed through the absence of desperation, which can only exist once the internal battle has been genuinely resolved, not performed, resolved. This doesn't mean becoming cold or detached from the desire for connection. The Stoics were not advocating for numbness. Seneca himself wrote about deep friendship and love as some of life's genuine goods. The goal was never to stop caring. The goal was to stop needing your peace to depend on the outcome of that caring. There's a profound difference between wanting someone deeply and needing them to complete you, and almost everyone has, at some point, confused the two. Once you see this clearly, you start seeing your life differently. Not just your romantic life, but your relationship with your job, your friendships, your own reflection in the mirror. The chase was never really about her. It was about a hole inside you that you hoped someone else's attention could fill. And no amount of external validation was ever going to fill an internal void, because that isn't what it was designed to do. So what does this actually look like day to day? Philosophy is only useful when it becomes practice. First, when the trigger happens, the delayed reply, the short response, the cancelled plan, pause before reacting. Give yourself even 60 seconds before typing anything. That pause is where your discipline lives. Second, ask yourself a specific question in that pause. Am I about to respond from security or from fear? This single question interrupts the automatic spiral and forces conscious choice back into the equation. Third, replace the thought. This means she's losing interest with the more accurate thought. I don't actually know what this means yet. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but false certainty built on fear is far more damaging than honest not knowing. Fourth, stop the behavior of over-explaining or over-apologizing to smooth over normal, minor friction. Practice saying less. A short, warm response often communicates more security than a long, anxious one. Fifth, actively build a life that doesn't revolve around her responsiveness. Real friendships, real goals, real physical and mental discipline. This isn't a strategy to make her jealous. It's the actual foundation that makes emotional stability possible in the first place, because a man with nowhere else to place his energy will always place too much of it in one direction. Finally, when emotions become overwhelming, return to what Epictetus called the dichotomy of control. Ask yourself plainly, is this within my control, or isn't it? Her feelings are not. Your character, your response, and your next choice always are. That single distinction, practiced daily, will do more for your emotional discipline than any tactic ever could. Think back to the question we opened with. Why the moment you need someone's approval most is exactly the moment it seems to slip away. You have the answer now. It was never about needing the wrong things or wanting connection too much. It was about where your sense of security was being generated. When it lived inside someone else's hands, every silence felt like danger, every delay felt like rejection, and every interaction became a performance instead of an experience. What changes now isn't a script you'll recite on your next date. It's the ground you're standing on when you walk into the room. Emotional stability instead of reactivity. Self-respect instead of quiet self-erosion. Confidence that doesn't need an audience. Presence instead of performance. A life full enough that you're not searching for someone to complete it. And beneath all of it, the willingness to feel deeply without needing to control the outcome. This is not a version of you built to win her over. It's a version of you built to be whole regardless of her answer. And it is precisely that wholeness, paradoxically, that people find impossible to look away from. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire and still had to fight, every single day, for command over his own mind. You are not being asked to do anything he didn't already know was hard. You are simply being invited to start. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I know there's no shortage of places to spend your attention, and the fact that you stayed until the end means something. If this video gave you even one moment of clarity about where you've been placing your peace, share it with someone who might need to hear it too. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thinking in your life, and when you're ready, the next video is waiting for you, because this journey towards self-mastery doesn't end with one video. It only really begins here.